X-Men 97 is an extremely mixed bag for me. And I say for me very deliberately, because if you're a true X-Men fan, this is pretty close to perfect. And if you love the original television series, then yeah, in execution, this is probably as good as it's gonna get. But after giving myself some time to reflect on the X-Men 97 series and kind of what I've witnessed, what I saw, and trying to really pinpoint the flaws and its failures, I realized something. None of my critiques seem to lead to a better version of the show. A different one for sure, but none that felt any more X-Men than this already did. So today I find myself asking the question, am I just no longer an X-Men fan? Have I outgrown the X-Men? So the first X book I ever read was X Factor number 63, and it dealt with Iceman and his girlfriend Opal. So the art here features Whilce Porticia, who was new to Marvel at the time, and I remember thinking, wow, this guy is really good, and I really bought that X book literally just for the art. And it involved a story about Iceman and Opal, his girlfriend. But it did represent the core X-Men crew, X-Men Classic, I would call it, right? We have Cyclops, Jean Grey, Beast, Archangel, and Iceman. And so I read X Factor all the way up until Jim Lee did X-Men number 1, where they moved those characters over to X-Men. And I began reading that. And in case you forgot, in 1991, Chris Claremont and Jim Lee launched X-Men number 1. And it really deals with Asteroid M and the whole Magneto trilogy, which was very forgettable outside of the art. Anyways, after Jim Lee leaves the title, I actually stopped reading X-Men for a very long time. And I move over to like Superman, Batman at the time. So flash forward a bunch of years and I hear about this amazing run by Peter David, and it's called the X-Men Messiah Complex. So I buy the omnibus and I read it, and I think it's okay. And this is where I think I start to realize that I probably don't actually like the X-Men that much. And to me, this is like saying I don't like science fiction, but I like high fantasy or something like that, to that effect. Because I know for a fact that it's well written and it's a good story. But it just didn't really resonate with me. And to that point, I had to really think about, at least for this video, who the X-Men really are, what it's trying to say, and what the message behind X-Men really is. So those are some of the things that I want to unpack and try to tackle in this video. And I just want to explore kind of my thought process, and maybe some people who kind of are like me and couldn't really get the words to express how they felt about this, but they knew that it wasn't awesome, 10 out of 10, perfect, or whatever hyperbolic titles there are out there. And I'm not blaming them. A lot of people really do like it. And I understand that. Like, I am not dense to the fact that this is a very good show. It was very well done and it was super well executed. And for the most part, I'm actually going to sing the praises of this show a lot and all the risks that they took trying to maybe make this, but then at the same time, risks that they didn't take. So if you've gotten this far and you love X-Men and you haven't put down a hate comment in the comments yet, which probably you already have, but if you haven't and you've suspended judgment and you want to wait to see what I have to say, then thanks for coming and let's take a ride with me and pick out some of the things that I loved and some of the things that I think could have been done better in this, what I'm going to call is an extremely well done, well executed X-Men 97 animation. So spoilers here because I'm going to cover the entire series. So if you haven't watched it, I would say go watch it. It's an excellent show. And I'm really just here to talk about the things that I enjoyed, the things that I saw, and some of the things that I think could have used a little love. And maybe they don't. Maybe they're perfect for you. And that's what I want to talk about. And if you do see something that I say, hey, it looks a certain way and it smells a certain way, but you don't think so, or you know better because you know all the lore and the canon, and you're like, Kenny, you missed like 3 decades of X-Men. You wouldn't even understand that. Then yeah, that's what I'm here for. I'm here for that discussion. So I'm just going to put out what I think and hit me up. Tell me in the comments. I want to know. Actually, like, that's not like clickbait. I actually want to know. All right. So if you weren't aware, X-Men 97 takes place after X-Men ends in 1996, which is why it's called X-Men 97. So it's a revival. And to its credit, I've never seen anything done like this before. They usually reimagine it, they reboot it, they restart it. But this actually takes place as a series sequentially right after 96. So props there. I mean, that's a huge risk in itself. Or is it, though? See, the nostalgia train for me and the nostalgia grab, for what it's worth, a lot of people say, oh, I thought this was a nostalgia grab, but they did the series well. And while I do agree that they did the series really well, and there's probably a bunch of actual fans that stayed true to the literature, true to kind of the series itself, I will say that just because that's the case doesn't mean it's not a nostalgia grab. They didn't try to create anything new or original. And in fact, you know, some of the series that they pulled in here are obviously really well done and already proof tested, proof positive, the best series of the X-Men going forward post 1997. But that's not to say that that's a bad thing. Of course, Infinity War was off the Infinity Gauntlet saga, and that was amazing, showing off what that might look like in real life. So I'm not discounting that. But what I am saying is it's still a nostalgia grab at this point. I guess the point I'm trying to make is somebody took a pitch where the marketing department and some of the bean counters really took a look at a bunch of pitches all at once. And one of them happened to be X-Men 97, which in their eyes was probably the safer bet because they're like, hey, this is an established market, an established IP. And we're talking about stories that have already been kind of filtered through the lens of, you know, comic aficionados through the years. So, and given that, I'm just kind of curious what kind of gems were left on the cutting room floor. Like what was not greenlit that could have been greenlit that was actually original and not nostalgic. And again, there's room for both. But to be honest, you know, when you put a creative team together and like that team is able to execute on this kind of level, that A team is now not creating content that is new. And I think that's obviously a theme for Hollywood in the last couple decades here, but there's nothing that we can fix here today, but still want to talk about and address it. So first things first, that nostalgic Saturday morning theme is back, and all of a sudden it has kind of appeal now. It's kind of weird. It actually changes a bunch throughout this season. There's 10 episodes, and a lot of the times it's different, but there's like one spot that sounds really good. Some of them sound okay, but yeah, they all kind of lead into like the actual kind of theme song that you all know and love. I hated it when I was a kid, and then I really hated it, and then I listened to it here, and then when they started kind of changing it a bit, it actually grew on me. And so, hey, I'm kind of a convert here. Totally fine now. I mean, I wouldn't listen to it on the radio or anything like that, but with these new remixes, at least I'm not like actively skipping them in agitation. So we start with the mutants in a precarious situation. As always, a fight as old as time, the whole civil rights movement for the mutants, right? And for a quick background on myself, I have 23 years of Army service, 13 of which were in special operations. And the reason I say that and that matters is because I did study social movement theory, because 3 core tenets of unconventional warfare are coerce, disrupt, and overthrow. That said, while this doesn't need to be realistic, and I don't expect anybody to have any type of realism layered into an X-Men 97 film/series, there are some cool things in here that actually make sense and kind of ring true. One of which is, you know, when you actually want to disrupt or do something new, you don't actually do the things of the past. So for instance, like Rosa Parks doesn't work nowadays because police kind of generally already know about that and can kind of, you know, de-escalate a Rosa Parks situation. Like the police are trained. So you want to do things that people are not kind of aware of, things that they call tactical innovations, right? And so you do see tactical innovations from Magneto and stuff like that. And we don't have to dive into that, but I'm just saying that there is some realism here where there doesn't need to be. And so that was fun for me. So I want to talk about the art because speaking from an artist, the aesthetic here, you know, originally in the old X-Men series, kind of just didn't like it. I thought it looked really sloppy, but they did an excellent job here. They've taken all the bad stuff of the aesthetic and gotten rid of it and just kept what's really good. I won't talk about this too much because they do a perfect job explaining it in the behind the scenes video, but just know that they really thought this out. Like they brought like the aesthetic choices that they really wanted, and then they added cinematic flair or kind of escape from those 1990s boundaries when it was not just permissible, but really relevant and useful. For instance, the action scenes. And as an artist, there's a couple things that I appreciate that have kind of come to like the forefront. So we were talking about Macross Plus in a previous episode, and what I said was the HD didn't hit as hard as the old VHS tapes. And there's a couple reasons for that. There's things that are happening there where it comes to kind of the way that lines are looked at or seen on a VHS or a CRT TV that distinguishes it and lets you kind of imagine kind of what the art looks like in a different way. Whereas the HD, when you have to do it, you actually have to redraw a bunch of frames and a bunch of panels and anything that pushes off the 4:3 into the 16:9. And so there's design choices and elements there that actually subdue or subtract from what is essentially supposed to be there. The point is there's a couple things that are going on here that if you pay attention to as an artist, you'll notice. One is chromatic aberrations. So that's just essentially taking layers of color and kind of pulling them apart a little bit. And if you do it enough, it looks like 3D essentially, because you're taking a layer of a certain color out and then you're just spreading it out. You've seen this in Spider-Verse, and they do it very, very drastically. But if you pull it apart just a little bit, it gives you that little flavor, that CRT flavor that you're kind of missing, and that does pull you back a little bit. There's also a little additive noise in there. It's very small and very subtle, but there's probably like a 3% noise added into the screen. Just a little bit of a flicker just to give you that kind of bite. And the final thing that they did that is super awesome is that they kind of unified the art style very, very cleanly. It's very structurally consistent, and then even with like some of the backgrounds and the mats, sometimes a lot of art directors kind of get away from that, especially when they start outsourcing. But this guy said, hey, no, there's only one texture brush and only use that one texture brush. And you can see it in a bunch of spots. That specific texture brush is the only texture brush. And so it stays super consistent. And then, of course, I can't ignore the fact that, you know, in terms of framing, in terms of frame rate, in terms of like smoothness or even lack of smoothness at times, that it actually all structurally stays pretty consistent. Except for the Jubilee dance scene. That thing was smooth as hell. And I actually appreciated that they put so much time into it, just because that made me feel a little sense of Jubilee a lot more than I have ever felt in any of the comics, these like kind of static panels. And it's kind of weird and interesting because I've been thinking about this a lot in my life. It's like when you see people and you see pictures, they don't really kind of do anything justice because you're not meant to see things still. You're actually meant to see things move. And so there is kind of a visceral thing that you pick out when things are imagined in animation or moving. And in this case, you know, Jubilee, for what it's worth, has always been a throwaway character to me. But when they put her in that scene, I kind of felt her energy a lot more than when they were just trying to explain it or express it. She was moving and she was doing her thing. And that's cool to me. So in terms of design choice, I do like how, you know, some of these characters are actually debuffed. Like I think Cyclops is pretty much debuffed. A big one is like the Gladiator. He's definitely super buff in the comics. And he's, I won't say debuff, but he's like more of a realistically muscular normal size. Like actually a bodybuilder could get that big. So, I mean, I know we've been in the land of ridiculous proportions for a long time in this kind of landscape and media. And so this is just really nice to kind of see things for what they are. I mean, they are still very exaggerated, make no mistake, but it's not to the extent where it becomes gross. So the story starts out with Professor X dead, and there's a conflict. And I don't mean the little fight in the beginning, because that's for X-Men is not even conflict. But the conflict here is basically Madeline Pryor, or the Jean Grey that Cyclops is with right now, thinks that they need to move on and start a family. And tale is old as time. And you know what? After the first watching, I don't think I gave it enough credit. What I mean by that is I think I kind of ignore or gloss over that plot point looking for the action, but that's actually the plot point. That is what makes X-Men the X-Men. And, you know, more to the point of what I was saying in the beginning, am I still an X-Men fan? These are the questions I ask myself because, like, essentially X-Men is an ensemble cast and you have to like the ensemble, and the ensemble needs to have some kind of synergy, not just fusion, synergy. And if you don't know what the difference between the two is, if you take two things and you fuse them together, they still become that thing. So, like, an iron bar and an iron bar become a longer iron bar. But synergy means that the story as a whole actually becomes exponential, becomes more than what it would have been. The telling of the tale, the team itself is far stronger when it synergizes and not just fuses together. So, and the problem that I see a lot of times with ensemble casts is the ensemble actually detracts or takes away from or subtractive from the collective story that's playing out. And what tends to happen is people, places, characters trying to do their own thing, i.e. Storm and Forge, which is generally okay. But if you're trying to tell a broader story, Storm and Forge need to come back, and that needs to really, really incorporate into what the story is trying to tell. And I'm not using that example as a bad thing. Storm and Forge is actually a really good thing here. And I really do like that exploration. And since we're talking about it, we might as well talk about it. There's some really cool shamanistic stuff that's going on with Forge culturally and some of the stuff that Storm's doing. But the one thing I will say is Storm leaves a little bit too damn quickly. I really don't buy it. So Storm loses her powers from like this shot that happens at the UN headquarters. And for what it's worth, you know, man, I would love it if UN had this much power in real life. Well, I wouldn't love it, actually. I wouldn't. Take that back. I don't know why I said that. But the UN in this universe is ridiculously powerful. And it's just such an artifact to like the 1990s where people thought that, you know, the UN, United Nations, NATO, whatever, all these organizations are just like so secretive, so kind of robust, where we just know that they just aren't. And they have no actual power on their own outside of the power of nations, right? So back to Storm here. What I mean by I don't buy it is Storm wouldn't just run away like that. So she loses her powers and then what? She's just like, I give up or whatever like that. And even though they had to run that arc, and I appreciate that arc, I think it could have been done different. The way she ran away and the way she left the letter, it's just not who she is. She's a pivotal kind of bedrock of the X-Men franchise. And again, like not for nothing, but Beast could have been that foil to kind of figure that out, because Beast figures everything out anyways, and he's super intelligent, especially with technologies. So there's a lot of characters who could do that, who could have. But yes, Storm instead gets sent off to Texas and finds Forge. That's fine, but I'm just saying she ran away too easily. I don't think she would give up like that. Her personality, her character, nothing in her spells run away as soon as stuff gets hard. And that's what it felt like. It may not have been the intention, but I'm just saying they could have massaged the script in a way that it didn't feel like that. Okay, so at the UN fight, there's something that happens here that's just kind of a logic misstep for me. And this is just, I just know that whoever wrote this just grew up in Hollywood, grew up with, I don't want to say a silver spoon, but as far as like the real world is, the world outside of the United States, outside of California, outside of Hollywood, this is a silver spoon, because here they have Cyclops in the middle of a losing battle. Nonetheless, the leader of the X-Men in a losing battle take away two real critical resources in Rogue and himself to go make sure his baby is born. So the birth of the baby is very important in people's lives, but not during a critical crisis. And let's just say I've had over 10 deployments across the world, and I've definitely missed more than one birth of a baby. And look, for normal people, that's a super special time, a super special thing. But in terms of this, in terms of the life that they've had, the lives that the X-Men lead, you know, let's just say as resilient as X-Men would have to be in these roles, they wouldn't think this way. And that's fine when you're making a kid's show. And I do understand that in the 96 Beyond version, you know, the predecessor. But for the 97 version, let me be very clear. 97 plus this X-Men 97 is not for kids. I will say it again. Nothing in this kind of whole thing smells kids. Yes, kids have access to it and it's accessible to kids, but the themes, the things that they do here, none of it is. And it does depart very substantially from the 96 kind of campiness. Any of that is pretty much gone. This is for adults. This is for the people who watched it when they were kids and are now adults. So given all that, if you want to say, you know, Cyclops is like this and we got to go get the birth of the baby, cool, but I don't think that's at all what Cyclops would do. And we know this because, you know, if we flash forward into the future, Messiah Complex, Cyclops goes pretty much insane making sure Hope stays alive. Like, as insane as ever. Like, literally kills off anything, does whatever is necessary to make sure the mutant savior that is Hope literally stays alive. And I suppose that I'll get a lot of pushback on that comment, but you know what? I just don't see that in Cyclops. I guess my point is this is some kind of young script writer, dialogue writer that, I don't know, didn't really cut it for me. And this kind of carries into the whole battle, because Storm here, if you see her kind of talking and yelling, she's just like yelling commands. And this is supposed to be a leadership thing or authority. And I've actually seen this a lot in movies recently. And I think this is a generational thing, and I don't really quite understand it. But yelling commands just because you're in charge or whatever like that, that's not leadership. Leadership has nothing to do with that. And it doesn't come across as that here. But again, I've seen it so much in movies that I really think that that's something that like kids or like the new generation think that is leadership. But Storm for me has always been like that eloquent arbiter of like things, right? And that mediator of sorts, that kind of that steadfast presence that actually doesn't even need to say anything. And that's kind of the power of Storm. And when I see her kind of, you know, put in a situation like this where she's just yelling at people, I don't know that that's the right Storm. But, you know, okay. So in the beginning here, the protesters have some serious cognitive dissonance here. And what I mean by that is they fear Magneto, and they have this whole thing about like usurping him and his power and stuff. And they know how powerful he can be and he can kill all these people. But then they don't fear him at all. They're just like going in there and trying to take over with whatever nonsense they have. Like there's one guy who might be able to do something because he has this gun, which nobody else knows. And this organization hasn't been kind of thoroughly kind of organized or cohesed in a way that makes any kind of sense. But that's cool. But they're protesters. I think if you would add more numbers, and I get it, the animation budget or whatever, but let's just imagine that there's like a lot of protesters, then that might make more sense, you know, kind of that mob rule. But from what we see here, it doesn't feel like there's that many, but I'm assuming that there was. I will say, though, when it comes to Storm dialogue that I did like, there's some really good dialogue here when like Storm is really crying out for her powers. It's like calling for a child that's no longer there, or even like losing the legs to walk or something that's so inherently you and all of a sudden is not there. I don't know what that feels like. I don't know that many people know what that feels like, but that feels about right. It's kind of like a king getting overthrown and now no longer has a kingdom. I always had like these real visceral thoughts about stuff like that, and this communicated that to me, and that was pretty cool. So here's the first time that Magneto is trying to redeem himself in terms of what Professor X has communicated to him. And this is really important, and we need to see this over and over again. So even though this is the first time we see it, it's not going to be the last time we see it, but it's really important that we've seen it more than once. It needs to be set up. And that's kind of another kind of criticism I have of this show, and a lot of people have this criticism, is it kind of moves too fast, like emotionally. Sometimes people are falling in love too fast, e.g. Storm and Forge or whatever. You know, there's a lot of spots where it could have been slowed down, and you have 10 episodes, and you have one filler episode that is the Jubilee episode, which, you know, maybe some people liked it, but honestly, I almost actually stopped watching at the Jubilee episode. I thought it was done, but the series doesn't even get good until episode 5+, which is kind of really kind of tragic, because I think there are people who probably would have ended on episode 4, because you literally set up the worst episode going into episode 5. So 2 characters that don't get much screen time in X-Men 97, and I think this is actually for the betterment because they've gotten a lot of screen time elsewhere, is Wolverine and Beast. And for what it's worth, you know, it was good that they've kind of pulled back a lot on those. And, you know, while Wolverine is super powerful or super popular, I think I'm glad that they focused on some other characters for this series. But before I forget, the most memorable line from the whole entire series is Wolverine's line, and it's right here. It's just too good.
You're Jean Grey. He's Scott Summers. Those are the rules. You just forgot him.
So the Madeline Pryor stuff is kind of interesting to me because we get through it so quickly. And I think we get through it quickly in the comics too. So this is not like a criticism of the show, but the whole thing is like, man, they don't even fight for it. It seems like it's like so matter of fact for them, because they're like, okay, I'm a clone. So what now? I got to run away. There's no way I stick around, right? I'm a clone. But that kind of removes all the agency that that character has. And then when you go set up the agency in the kind of post of that, meaning like when Nathan comes back, Cable, and you see that it's a true character, but you pull away from it so quick that that doesn't hit as hard. And it may hit as hard for some people, and it did for me, but I'm just saying that, like, I think if you would have established that he wanted to fight a lot harder for her, and we do see Cyclops fight, that emotional battle, but I think there's a toil there that could have been even more expressly written out, because viewers are dumb, and even myself included, when we're thinking about that stuff, you need to put it in our face for us to actually absorb it. And I didn't quite absorb it as much as I would have loved to. And I think that's like a tearjerker moment that really was kind of left on the table. Okay, so now we're going to flash forward to where the story actually starts. And I think that's from episode 5 to 10. All right, so in episode 5, we get this shot of the Watcher up here in the upper left-hand corner watching over this. And this is pretty significant because post this, anything before that actually happened in the 96 in that contemporary time frame. Anything that's happening now to the present is actually from the present, meaning they're pulling from comics and from stories that are traditionally in the comics that are like 2000 plus. And in terms of writers and Easter eggs, I really don't care for like the Stark Industry logos and all that other stuff, but stuff like that is super cool, especially if you're able to pick it out and, you know, it means something because they're trying to signal something to you, which is cool. Anyways, we see Magneto in this, what I would just loosely call a 80s wrestling outfit. And that's what I said when I first saw it and I was watching it with my son. And it's kind of funny because, you know, we haven't seen anything like that. Anyway, it's so glaring that I had to only assume that it came from somewhere. So I actually went and looked this up, and it's from the 1986 issue number 200. It's an actual costume that he wore. So yeah, old school costume gets revived. Cool. Whatever. It's definitely interesting to say the least. And sure, I mean, if you want to do fan service, this is how you do it. And so we're going to talk about Genosha Island. And for the kids who failed history class, this represents something that's really real and actually really relevant right now. I'm not even going to say it out loud because I feel like if you cared about it, you'd already know about it by now. And it's just such an obvious parallel and juxtaposition that it really doesn't need to be unpacked here. And I could only do a disservice by trying to abstract the kind of conflict there. Okay, so I wrote this twice in my notes, so I'm just going to entertain this thought really quickly here. Rogue's voice. It didn't really work for me in the 90s episode, but it was okay. But come to find out that it's still the same person doing her voice 27 years later. And this is where I'm not drawing a line. I really don't care because, you know, the character has already never been properly done for me here in the animated series or in the real life action series even. So instead of me having an opinion on this, I actually would put the opinion to voice actors and actresses. Like, does it make sense? Does voice talent work that way? Is it kind of modular like that? Or is it more nuanced? Like, could a voice actor, actress, or better yet, somebody who's an audiophile really pick out that, hey, this is a 27-year-old voice, this is like a 60-year-old voice? Like, that's the question that I would ask. For me, Rogue definitely sounded older. All right, so episode 5, we get the gambit we finally deserve. He gets this scene where he actually kind of dies, but in sacrifice and in the right kind of ways. And there's a heartfelt moment where Rogue is like, I can't feel you. And wow, that's a great scene. Even though we know, and I know, that he's coming back, it's still a great scene. It hits really, really hard. 10 out of 10 moment. There's a scene here where Forge looks a lot like Doctor Strange. I really just want somebody to comment here and tell me what the hell's going on here because I don't remember his powers being this like abstract and looking this magical. But I don't remember, and I'm not going to look it up because I know somebody's going to correct me here. So please do. Thanks. All right, so Xavier comes back to Earth and he's like, on me, my X-Men, and all that stuff. And here we see Charles Xavier trying to get back into the good graces of the team/family. And Cyclops, for one, isn't having it. And he has a ton of recalcitrance for like letting Professor Xavier back in. And that's because he hurt Cyclops' feelings. I've never found this realistic, or I've never found this compelling in the comics, nor is it compelling here. It always felt very beneath him to beg like this. And I think it's because the dialogue has never been written properly. I don't mind him trying to earn the trust and re-earn the loyalty of his kind of subordinates or family in this case, but I always thought the dialogue was always lacking and it felt really beggy. I feel like he should have been a more honorable character. I don't know, that's just me personally. If you think that it worked, then let me know why I'm missing the point here, because I just feel like it feels really beggy here. Like he's like, oh, let me come back. And I get it. Of the two characters, Magneto and Xavier, he's the empathetic one. He's literally an empath. And so he feels the emotion, whereas, you know, the stoicism should come from Magneto. But at the same time, as a mature adult, the adult in the room, there has to be some level of stoicism there to be able to kind of communicate kind of just matter-of-fact feelings to people. And again, as an empath, I don't know that that comes across for me. And if it does for you, kind of explain to me what I'm getting wrong here, because I don't feel it. So there's a scene here with Beast and Trish Tibley, the reporter, that, you know, they have a little thing going on in the comics or whatever. So I appreciate the setup, but the cool thing is, like, terms of tone, they used characters that they had. They used conversations that they could have between characters. And this is one of those ones where, like, yes, you need to establish a tone very quickly about the aftermath of this. And they used the right characters here, I think. And the way that Beast does this or says this is super compelling to me. So in episode 6, we see Rogue go dark for about 10 minutes. And she just goes off the rails, which, conditionally speaking, makes very perfect sense to me. But I guess some of the things that are forgivable or can be forgiven are kind of moved on a little bit too quickly. But I'm honestly okay with that because the story does need to drive forward. And as compelling as that kind of argumentative kind of back and forth between like Rogue's ethics here could have been, I don't think it's necessary because I think what the writers were trying to showcase is that there's so many things happening and the world is in such a mess and such shambles that that's just the least of their concerns. But again, you know, I wish that would have been the case when, you know, the world was kind of ending and Scott Summers decides to go see his baby. You know what I mean? So there's a scene here in episode 9 that I truly love, and it really kind of just puts a kind of exclamation point on what this show may or may not be trying to say or do.
Am I going to war or a circus?
What'd you expect? Black leather?
So I've been thinking about this a lot, and of course, this is why in the beginning I said, I'm not so sure about this, and it's a mixed bag for me. And I really want to explain this and kind of get to the outro here, because what I want to do here is really talk and break this down. Like, it's really important to think about like the writers and what they're trying to say. If this is just like a fifth wall break and just a nod to kind of fan service, then fine, albeit it works really well and psychologically it works, sure. But if not, if this is an actual kind of like smite upon you, you idiots who made these X-Men movies and didn't really care about the X-Men and didn't love the characters as much as I did and didn't stay true to the source as much as I did, then I think it's compelling. Because in some ways, and this is why I say maybe I don't like the X-Men as much as I used to, if I was going to do this, I don't think I would have seen this vision through like this. There's almost no way. I would have definitely modernized. I definitely would have tried to make it a little bit more action-oriented, a little bit flavor of this, a little bit flavor like that. And in the end, you know, that's where people like Snyder get a reputation for being either good or bad, love him or hate him. You know, he brings his own unique flavor or flair to these characters. And so I imagine that this is kind of the writers saying that, like, you ruined a bunch of stuff that I really, really liked. And if that's true, and if that's what we're saying here, then I get it. And I get that maybe I'm not the X-Men fan that I used to be, because I definitely would have made this differently. But that's really, really okay. And I want to say that I still thoroughly enjoyed this, and I still thoroughly enjoyed somebody's vision coming on screen that was far, far detached or detracted from my own. And storytelling does stand alone. The point I'm trying to make here is you don't have to be an X-Men fan, or you shouldn't have to be an X-Men fan to enjoy a proper X-Men film. In the same way as I really didn't like the Avengers when I was a kid, but Avengers, that whole saga, all the way up to Endgame, was absolutely amazing, and it was a treasure. It was dealing with characters that I really didn't care about except for Thor. Thor was like the only character that I followed when I was younger. Outside of that, all those characters, oh, and Doctor Strange. But besides Thor and Doctor Strange, I could care less. Like, I wanted to see Silver Surfer or some of these other characters, right? But outside of that, I mean, they took something that was generally kind of lesser known, less popular. And they really, really made it dominate the space with really good storytelling and really good writing. And this is really well executed. Really, really good storytelling. And I'm not so sure about the rest, which is why I say it's a mixed bag. And so if you loved it and you enjoyed it, I am so happy for you. But I also think that we've been kind of starved for content lately. And so maybe this is just rosy-eyed glasses looking at something that's saying, hey, maybe there's a chance, you know, a breath of fresh air. And I hope it is. And I'm totally rooting for the X-Men. And I'm rooting for the live action to be very, very good, because I really want to see a proper X-Men. So given all that, my final opinion is, yes, it's still a mixed bag for me, but it's really, really fucking good.